Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most fascinating and honestly baffling theological paradoxes out there. We are looking at a man whose own hands forged Israel's absolute greatest idol, yet he's the very same guy who ended up offering their holiest sacrifices. We're talking about Aaron, brother, priest, failure, and type. It's a massive story of incredible calling, catastrophic failure, and frankly, staggering grace. Seriously, think about it. How in the world did the man who actively led Israel's greatest rebellion end up becoming the sole mediator of their salvation? Well, we're going to dig into the gritty, real-life story of Israel's very first high priest. And as you'll see, his profound human limitations, and he had a lot of them, pointed directly to a necessary, perfect fulfillment down the line. Let's start with part one, the voice beside Moses. You gotta remember the backstory here. Aaron was born into slavery 3 years before Moses. That means there is a massive psychological gap between these two brothers. One was forged in brutal, backbreaking oppression, while the other was literally raised in the luxury of Pharaoh's palace. That dynamic shapes absolutely everything. So when God tells Moses, "He shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him," it sets up this really fascinating chain of double mediation. Think about it. God speaks to Moses, Moses speaks to Aaron, and then Aaron speaks to the people. Aaron was always at his absolute best when he was just channeling a word that wasn't his own. He was that vital, supportive link in the chain. But then we hit part two, the catastrophe. So Moses goes up Mount Sinai and leaves Aaron completely alone for 40 days, and Aaron is suddenly staring down a restless, anxious, leaderless mob. Forced to act on his own initiative, he makes a genuinely catastrophic decision. And it's important to realize the sheer scale of this failure. It was a massive compound failure. He didn't just passively stand by and watch it happen. He actively collected the gold. He fashioned the calf with a graving tool. He built the altar himself. And then he declared this weird, syncretic feast to the Lord. That's the real tragedy here. His attempt to domesticate the divine by blending Egyptian theology right into Israel's covenant. And it gets worse. When Moses finally comes down and confronts him, Aaron delivers this absolute gem of an excuse. "So they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." I mean, no way, right? It is literally one of the most brilliantly rendered instances of moral evasion in all of ancient literature. He's essentially giving the ancient equivalent of "the dog ate my homework." He paints himself as this totally passive bystander, acting like a golden idol just magically popped out of the campfire all on its own. Which brings us to part three, glory, beauty, and atonement. Now, you'd think the whole golden calf fiascos would disqualify him forever, right? I mean, career over. But in this astonishing display of institutional grace, this exact same man, the idol maker, is consecrated as Israel's high priest. It involved this grueling 8-day sequence of consecration. You've got days 1 through 7 filled with rigorous washing, dressing, and anointing, all leading up to day 8, the inaugural day of priestly service. And that precise 8-day sequence wasn't random. It deliberately echoed the Genesis creation narrative. It represented a literal new creation of a sacred mediating institution. And the garments he wore for this, absolutely breathtaking. These heavy, highly textured vestments were quite literally theology worn on the human body. He bore the breastpiece of judgment, which meant he was physically carrying the names of the 12 tribes right over his heart every time he entered the divine presence. He carried the mysterious Urim and Thummim, and right on his forehead, a solid golden plate engraved with "Holy to the Lord." He was visibly bearing the guilt of the people's defective offerings, carrying the weight of the entire community squarely on his shoulders. And that heavy responsibility peaks on the most sacred day of the year, Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. But notice the very first step of the ritual. Aaron actually takes off those magnificent golden robes and puts on stark, plain white linen garments. And here is a striking detail you might not know. Those plain white clothes were completely identical to traditional burial garments. He bathes, slays the sin-offering goat for divine justice, lays his hands on a live scapegoat to confess Israel's sins, and sends it out into the wilderness. So, dressed as a man who had already died, Aaron solemnly bore the staggering weight of the nation's annual covenantal reconciliation. But this high calling came with a dark side. Part 4, tragedy and silence. You see, proximity to the divine presence carried a terrifying, uncompromising demand for absolute holiness. And tragically, Aaron's 2 eldest sons, Nadab and Abihu, violated that demand. They decided to offer uncommanded or unauthorized fire before the Lord, and the result was instantaneous.
The exact same divine fire that had just consumed their accepted offerings flared out and consumed Aaron's sons in divine judgment. They were struck dead right there, on the very inaugural day of their service. Just a devastating, heartbreaking reality.
Which leads us to a really jarring question. Why in the world was Aaron strictly forbidden from mourning his own sons? God explicitly commanded him not to tear his clothes, not to let his hair hang loose, not even to step foot outside the tabernacle. Why? Because the sacred anointing oil of God was still on him. The institution of the priesthood had to survive. If the high priest abandoned his post in that moment, wrath would fall on the entire camp. The harsh, gritty reality is this. The institution completely overrode the father. His consecration had to be total. So how did Aaron respond to this unimaginable pain? With absolute silence. It is a profoundly moving act of covenantal fidelity. He proved, right then and there, that his agonizing subjective grief could not, and would not, override the objective reality of the sanctuary's service. He chose trust over protest. Let's move to Part 5, Rebellion and Grace. So, Aaron's priesthood didn't just face internal family tragedy, it faced massive external challenges too. The biggest was a deeply organized democratic rebellion led by a guy named Korah. And to settle this massive dispute over leadership, God vindicated Aaron definitively. But he didn't do it through some human argument or logical debate, he did it with a miracle. God caused Aaron's dead, severed wooden staff to miraculously sprout buds, blossom, and actually produce ripe almonds overnight. Dead wood produced life from within itself. It was a stunning, undeniable visual confirmation of his exclusive calling. And honestly, this perfectly illustrates the definition of institutional grace. It's God maintaining his purposes through broken instruments. It's God relying entirely on his own divine faithfulness rather than on human perfection. That rod that budded, it's really the overarching metaphor for Aaron's entire life, a profound symbol of life and grace emerging precisely in the places where human failure absolutely could not disqualify it. And finally, Part 6, the shadow and substance. Aaron's life eventually comes to a close on Mount Hor. He dies without disgrace, passing his heavy vestments directly to his son Eleazar. That simple act proved that the sacred office outlasted the failing man who first held it. But, his legacy lives on most powerfully in the famous Aaronic benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. It's this beautifully balanced blessing where Aaron was most fully, truly himself, just faithfully placing God's name and God's peace onto the people. Ultimately, as the New Testament book of Hebrews maps out, Aaron's priesthood was really pointing towards something greater. Look at the contrast here. The Aaronic priesthood relied on mortal priests, endlessly repeated sacrifices, and an earthly tabernacle that was really just a copy. But Christ's priesthood, it features an eternal priest, a definitive once-for-all sacrifice, and a true heavenly sanctuary. Aaron's priesthood was this necessary, gritty shadow and tutor. It was doing the heavy lifting of preparing Israel for the superior, eternal substance of Christ. So I want to leave you with a final, provocative question as we wrap up this explainer. Think back to the beginning. If the very man who forged a golden idol with his own hands was the exact same man chosen by God to mediate the forgiveness of an entire nation, what does that reveal about the absolute depths of divine grace? We're left to ponder how Aaron's immense limitations, his failures, and his paradoxes are exactly the things that allow us to grasp the eternal substance of grace today. Thanks so much for joining me as we explored this incredible story.